Hi, John Clements here. Today I have a wonderful hand-ground Type 15 arming sword. It could be considered a Type 16, but it's in between the 15s and 16s. Created by Paul Brach, who was a contestant on Forged in Fire. And I have to say, having the opportunity that Paul gave me to actually play with a hand-forged blade and really go to town with it, doing some test cutting with it, flourishing with it, pel work with it, contacting another blade, sharp piece, was quite a splendid opportunity. This is a gorgeous piece, and I told Paul when I first met him and first handled this, I said, wow, this is astonishing that this is a first-time piece made by a first-time sword maker. Absolutely stunning. The point is very thickened, and that allows it to get into mail, to jam into even pieces of plate. It's a wide tapering blade of this style, and it has some mass behind it. It's a robust piece, but it's quite stiff, and with that triangular shaped cross section and that subtle riser. The pommel is flattened and yet large. It's crying out to be used in armor, and playing with it with a gauntlet, it shined better. It also is crying out to be used against armor, but it's a splendid, incredible, agile piece, ideal for using with a buckler. Now, about that typology, Oakshot's typology, and Oakshot said this to me in person. He said, John, my typology was only meant as a framework. I didn't mean it as a taxonomy. It's just a general way of looking at pieces because all swords are individual pieces. And between any two models, let's say this earlier Norman style, between these two models, you're going to have so many intermediary pieces, and we are coming along later and classifying them where they stand out with distinction. Here's another blade, very similar. And this one actually is flatter in cross section and does not have the thickening point on it. And it weighs about 2 pounds more than this one, despite this one being more of a diamond shape. Here's another blade. This one is about 2 ounces lighter than this one, despite it being about 2 inches longer, flatter with a long fuller about 4/5 the length. This is a nice fine blade, but it's different than this one and slightly different in how it handles. And if you even compare it to a later long sword, similar, very similar cross sections, very similar geometry to the pieces. This one's actually thicker, it tapers more, it's got a longer handle, and yet weight-wise, it's comparable. So when you're looking at pieces, swords, keep in mind that our typology is artificial. It's useful, but it's artificial. These are always handmade pieces that were individual. A swordsman might make many types of this model, but he also would vary between the pieces. What's wonderful today is that the classification system and the names of the different blades, we're not having to rely on the terminology created by 19th century antiquarians or 20th century collectors and curators. Instead, we're able to go on the names given to swords from the historical fight books, and working with modern swordsmen who are trying to reproduce these weapons, they are also looking at the historical terminology more and more, and not the artificial collector's terminology. So a blade like this has the width to close in, do some serious cleaving blows, and yet it's agile enough and has enough of a taper to give some very accurate thrusting actions even with one hand. And that's what I really like about this style of blade. You don't see it used too often in the historical fight books. One of the Talhofer manuals comes to mind. Now, the Oakshot had an original specimen like this, actually a little wider, in his house, and I got to handle that one, take it out in his garden, and actually cut a few tree branches with it, and it was phenomenal. He also had a similar one, almost identical, in his kitchen, and he told me, take that down. I took it down, and he asked me what I thought of it. For a second, I thought I should be polite and say something nice, but I held it, and I just said, I don't like it. And he said, why? And I said, I don't know. There's just something wrong, something off. It just feels not right. He said, very good. That it was a 19th century forgery. Wow. Yeah, wow. So even these swordsmiths in the 1800s, who were had surrounded by real specimens to copy, weren't getting it right. And that's why today it's phenomenal to me that someone like Paul Brach, under the tutelage of the excellent sword maker Peter Johnson, are able to reproduce pieces that I, as a fighter, as a swordsman, am picking up and saying, I like this. I would feel confident defending my life with this. I would feel confident going into close combat with this, in armor, out of armor. I can have confidence that this is going to work from how it feels. But the last thing, of course, is to take it outside and give it some tests. To me, when I'm playing with the weapon, testing it out, and in this case, Paul said, hey, would you like to test this for a bit? And I said, I would love to play with that. So we're putting it through paces. And we're not doing this because it's a commercial weapon that's going to be marketed. We're doing this because Paul believes, as I do, in the resurgence of the ancient relationship between the makers and the users. So that if you're a swordsmith trying to get the geometry and the metallurgy and the overall proportions correct, then you better damn well be trying to get it correct for its functional use. And that means coming to an expert swordsman. If you were making a golf club, you wouldn't just make it from drawings and measurements. You'd want the input of a professional expert golfer. You know, it's the same thing with swords. Or if you're making a guitar, you want a guitarist and a musician to test your piece. You don't want to just go on your own inexperience and your own lack of knowledge in music and techniques of guitar, right? So anyway, but it's very difficult for a lot of swordsmiths today to receive the criticism from the users, because after all, we're just the users. We're just studying the authentic historical methods, and we're just martially and athletically training in them rigorously and vigorously for decades. That's all. What do we know about how the sword should perform and function? So now I have a target which I can put some impact into and not worry about it doing that. Make sense? So I love this type of fence post kind of Pell. So I love Pell work because I think, other than flourishing with the weapon for hours, there's very few things that give you as good a feedback as to how a weapon performs than to be able to go at a Pell and to hit it and go past it as well, because you don't always want to throw every single blow at it, as long as you're aiming at it. This one's not stabilized in the ground, so I don't want to knock it over, but I do want to get that feel for how accurate this thing can do on its thrusts. You know, I want to tell. I want to know how accurate it is, short and long cuts and transitioning between them. So, yeah, definitely an agile and yet robust blade with some mass behind it, but some agility too. Very nice, very nice. Yeah, can't wait to try out a final version of this one. Pretty sweet, pretty sweet. I need to fill it with more water, obviously. Yeah, it's a robust blade. It wants some counter weight with the armor, but still very nice. get a little bit of trauma on the blade, just a little bit, because it's very sharp. And that's a pretty soft steel blade I'm striking at. I'm not going full force. I always like to do a little bit of steel on steel testing when I'm playing with the blade. I'll just rig it up on something. Doesn't even have to be that stable. I actually want it to have a little bit of give to it. And I'm not hitting edge on edge. I'm just doing edge on flat and some flat on edge. But that gives me a good idea as to its durability. Because again, I'm not looking at this from a knife point of view, a knife edge. I'm looking at it from the point of view of swords. And I do this test towards the end because it will, if the edge is very sharp, you'll see a lot of folding and a lot of little, not gouges or nicks, but close to it. Nothing that can't be polished. So because over the decades I have cut with a lot of different swords and a lot of models of the same swords, I like to compare two different models, one I'm familiar with one I'm not, to give a bit of a baseline. But again, comparing it to the cutting portions, absolutely comparable. In fact, this one might be a little sharper, but because of its cross section, the thickness, the bevel is actually a little smaller, and it has more mass and material that it has to put out of the way. Again, going back to the wood test, we're going to do a little cut on the same spot. All right. And wow. Okay, let's try another one a little lower here. Oh! And in my opinion, it had more of an effect, much more of an effect. Now, for a strong cut, again, going to about right here, have to do it comparable to the same spot, same distance, and the same type of strike I did. Nope, it moved. Let's try it again. Ooh, I like that though. Oh. All right. Oh, jeez. So, went through, I believe, and then broke the piece off. And again, not a stabilized piece of wood, so to me that's pretty impressive that it does that kind of break. Yeah, nice. All right. Yeah, that's pretty good. You wouldn't want that on your forearm or your collar or your shin bone for sure. And that's why arming swords like that style were around for a good long time and were found to be so effective. And like this one as well, similar. Their utility was proven as a single-hand arming sword. And of course the double-handed longsword versions that were contemporary with them, various types. And they stayed around until eventually, as armor declines, they get replaced by more narrower, longer, single-hand, cut and thrust military and civilian swords.